Hi, I'm Feminism Kim, and doing another video. I'm just using the webcam on my laptop, and I'm not wearing any makeup or anything, because this is kind of one I wanted to do quickly. But basically, there was something. I did a video yesterday about something I'd been thinking about on the way to work. I remembered something else that I was thinking about on the way to work, so I thought I'd do this video really quickly just to get it out there before I forget all about it. So anyway, but maybe it's good that I'm not wearing any makeup and looking rather male as a result, because I want to talk about inequalities that affect men. Because of course it's quite common to have men's rights activists talk all sorts of things about the ways in which men are treated unfairly by society, and the way that women, and feminists in particular, are kind of blind to these things that men face, and yeah, that feminism is anti-men, and some it seems they sort of want to blame feminism for some of these things that affect men unfairly. So I wanted to look at this question, and I had some thoughts on the way to work about this. So I want to put this very plainly, because I think it's important that the people in question understand. Um, so yeah, I agree that any. Let's start by trying to untangle all this, men's rights and feminism and blah. Um, I want to start with saying any group can conceivably be oppressed by another group. In theory, if we strip away everything else, if we just look at it in the most basic terms, any group could conceivably be oppressed by another group. So even in theory, those groups which tend to hold a lot of power and influence in the world, for example, depending on context, could indeed find themselves the victims of oppression. For example, white people in Africa, where there's mostly black people, could, I suppose, find themselves oppressed by the black majority. Uh, and don't think it doesn't happen. I'm sure it does sometimes. Um, in practice, it happens very rarely, I think, because the influence and power of someone who's come from the West to Africa with economically means that um, they'll tend to be respected to a certain extent, um, just because they have that kind of money and that kind of influence, and that kind of background. Uh, if they do get hated on, it'll be more as the way people hate on someone with a lot more power and influence than them. So it's a very different thing to oppressive hatred. But on the other hand, in theory, it could happen, and I'm sure it does rarely happen, that white people are oppressed by black people in a part of the world where there's more black people. So that's an example of where a group that usually is in a higher position of power and influence could find themselves oppressed by another group of people. So, yeah, in theory, any group could conceivably be oppressed by another group, even if in practical terms it might be highly unlikely. I would like to say as well that gender is a little bit different to things like race or sexuality or disability, for example, because it is a lot more complex, actually, which group has the power. Despite what some feminists would like us to believe, there are gender is a lot more of a reciprocal relational thing in the first place. It tends to affect everybody. There's no escaping from it, and it tends to infect every aspect of a person's life. So when it does affect that person negatively, it can be pretty crushingly hard to deal with. And the whole relational thing between men and women make it a unique case, I feel, a lot of the time with regards to these inequalities. So any group could conceivably be oppressed by another group, um, and only someone in that group can really talk about the full extent of what that oppression feels like. Now, the reason I say this is because a lot of these things involve attitudes as well as overt oppression. Oppression is not always overt. It's not always legal. It's not always as easy to point to as actual oppression. There are the effects of attitudes as well, which can make a person's day-to-day life. It can colour a person's day-to-day life when they are continually subjected to negative attitudes and stereotypes from the other group. And because it involves these attitudes, it's not always overt oppression. outsiders can't always recognise all of it. They only recognise the overt oppression. So it is important to listen to people within a marginalised group about the oppression they face, about the attitude or behavioural oppression they face on a day-to-day basis, because you don't know what it's like, because you don't experience it. With regards to those two things, I want to say we really do need to start listening to each other. Women do need to start listening to the problems that men face when men face certain forms of inequalities or unfairness due to gender, because it's not like men can't ever face unfairness because of their gender. Gender, as I said, was a special case where it's not so clear who is the one with the power and who is the one without. Obviously there is an imbalance of power, but things spill over. Negative impacts of gender roles affect both genders, and all genders. So women do need to start listening to men. But also, the thing about these men's rights activists, for all they're talking about how feminism is a hate group and how they believe in equality, if they really believed in equality, they would be listening to feminists instead of instantly dismissing the feminist arguments, because only women know about the oppression that women face. Only women know about the attitudinal and behavioural aspects of that oppression, and we need to listen to them. So I have never, even though I identify as androgynous and neither a man nor a woman, it's definitely true that I've never walked through the world being perceived as and interacted with by people as if I was a woman. So I cannot talk about anything about what women face. Women should talk about that themselves. On the other hand, though, I was raised as a boy. I have moved through the world being perceived as and being interacted with as if I was a man, so I can talk about oppression that men face and the unfairness. I don't think oppression is quite the right word, but the unfairness and the behavioural and attitude things that affect men negatively. I can talk about those. So, what about the men? What inequalities and unfairness do affect men negatively? Well, you can talk about certain legal loopholes with regards to custody and stuff. By the way, these predate feminism and are totally to do with redressing an imbalance that affected women negatively at the time. And obviously times have changed and it needs reviewing. But anyway, feminism is not to blame for those things. But we could talk about some of those little legal matters. I want to talk more about, because I've never had children or whatever, I've never been affected by any of these legal issues, but I want to talk about things that have affected me negatively, to do with some of the attitudes people have, to do with gender roles actually. But 3 ways in which life can be a little bit unfair to men or those who are perceived to be men. One is the whole, if you have a personal crisis, you don't get the kind of support you don't get the kind of support from people you would if you were a woman, I don't think. You get a lot of this, stop whining and complaining and man up sort of talking. So that I think is a very serious matter. Men are expected to stop whining and man up. They don't get people crowd around helping them when they have personal issues. And I mean, that's why you see the suicide rates and shit like that. So it is an important point to make. A second way in which life can be somewhat unfair, unequal for men, is with regards to sexual roles. You are expected, I think, to perform sexually. If you can't, a lot of women seem to turn around and say, don't you fancy me or whatever, or they'll blame you for not providing sex. They feel they have the right to, because men are supposed to provide sex. Men are supposed to be ever horny and able to. There is a lot of this nonsense. There is a lot of this nonsense in society, and you do get a lot of this nonsense from women, and it's not fair, because sometimes we can't feel comfortable or relaxed or get aroused, and we need as much consideration and support about things like that as women do, to be honest. So there is that. And then the third way in which men might be treated unfairly, or unequally, is with regards to rigid expectations of our appearance. You know, women can wear trousers or skirts, they can have short hair or long, they can wear makeup or no makeup, and go about their lives. And okay, if they're a bit too tomboyish, maybe they'll get the "you're a lesbian" kind of thing. But by and large, they don't get the heavy amount of ridicule and harassment that a man would have should he start wearing high heels and makeup and skirts and even just having a hair long. When I still identified as a man and I had long hair and did nothing else, everything else was male, jeans, t-shirt, leather jacket, whatever, but long hair. I got so much shit from people. Seriously, just random people would tell me that I need to get a haircut or make jokes about not knowing where the barbers is and shit like that. It's unbelievable. And you know, guys saying, "Oh, I thought you were a woman from behind" and all that. And you know, it's just the huge amount of harassment and basically bullying and ridicule you get with anything that out of what's expected of a man to wear and look like. That's not fair, is it? But what I want to say about all these things that are unfair to men, where men might have to face inequalities that affect them negatively, is that every single one of these is caused by the same thing, and it is the same thing that feminism itself is fighting against. And I'm not going to call it by what feminists call it by, because that seems to be a term of some contention. I'm going to call it what I prefer to call it as, which is, and what it actually is, which is stupid, outdated, sexist gender roles. Stupid, outdated, sexist gender roles hurt men and women equally, and the same things that hurt women and feminists are fighting against are the same things that hurt men, and with regards to the things I've just mentioned. It's stupid, outdated, sexist gender roles, or as is particularly pleasing for me as an androgynous, non-binary person who feels hurt by gender a lot in my life. SOS, grr. So, yeah. With regards to feminism, I think it is a far better ally than the men's rights activists for dealing with these issues that affect men negatively. And I want to say I don't always agree with feminism. There are two particular ways in which I tend to sometimes disagree with certain types of feminists, because I'm aware it's not all of them. One is with regards to Puritanism and prudery. I distrusted anti-sex kind of arguments, negative attitudes towards the celebration and expression of sexuality in society, and this negative attitude towards what I think is basically in itself a positive thing. I'm not saying there's not ever exploitation in the sex industry or whatever, but I do not trust prudish, puritanical arguments. I did not trust them when they came from Christians. I do not trust them when they come from feminists either. Basically, sex is good. Celebration of sex is good. And exploitation does happen, but then it is a career choice that is freely chosen by some women. You can claim it's down to patriarchy, but I wonder who is exploiting who a lot of the time. You know, a lot of lonely, messed up men who find it hard to communicate with the opposite sex are preyed upon by these prostitutes, especially street prostitutes. When they approach you, you've had a good night out, you're drunk and full of drugs or whatever, and they will use that to their advantage to get money out of you. I mean, who's exploiting who? It's a lot more complicated than it's often made out by those who are very anti-prostitution. It's a lot more complicated than that. You need to ask yourself why men feel they need to pay for sex, and why women by and large don't pay for sex. We need to ask why there's a career opportunity there for women that's not even there for men, because it's not like men wouldn't want to sell their body for money if they could, and it would be great. A lot of men think that would be great, sex and money. Quids in, yeah. So one needs to ask why that's not an option for men. And the reason it's not an option for men is that women, by and large, so unless you want to be a gay prostitute, women, by and large, don't pay for sex. So would anyone ask why men do? And once you start asking this question, it's a lot more complicated than men are oppressing women. Something very weird that seems unfair on both sides is happening. As for porn, though, or as for pop stars celebrating their sexuality in their videos, I just think it's not inherently bad in itself. I mean, for us to depict and celebrate sex is actually in itself not a bad thing. And I'm very dubious of any puritanical arguments that seem to suggest it is. Once you get rid of coercion or exploitation, I don't see what the problem is at all. And people freely deciding that they'll celebrate sexuality, even earn money from celebrating their sexuality. Fair enough. Anyway, and the other area where I tend to sometimes disagree with certain, well, I tend to disagree with certain types of feminism, of course, when they get all trans exclusionary, but that's a subject for another video. But so yeah, that was a little bit about inequalities that affect men and my own feelings about feminism. It's a better ally than men's rights activists for the inequalities that really do affect men, or male socialized people. And yeah, thanks for watching.